just for a few minutes. Mesopotamia is a Greek word that means land in the midst of rivers. And the land is defined by the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, you can see on the drawing there. And after the Tower of Babel, Terah, Abraham's father, migrated to this area. And of course, the descendants of Noah's son Ham, and I didn't give you the handout for Ham, but I'll give that to you in another week. But I have one of those for Ham, and also one for Jacob, Noah's other son. But the descendants of Noah's son Ham, particularly Cush and Nimrod, settled in the land of Shinar, and that's the area of Iraq. And Shem's descendants, including Arpachshad, which was the third son of Shem, they're associated with the Chaldeans, and they settled in the land of the lower Euphrates near the land of Ur. And later they developed a Samaritan city-state, and one of those city-states was called Ur of the Chaldeans, and most of the southern and central Mesopotamia was dominated by a king called King Ur III, and his dynasty opened up that area. And his grandfather, Ur-Nammu, and his father, Shuji, were kings responsible for building the great tower of Ur. And later in history, King Nebuchadnezzar refurbished that tower, and it stands today, and it's called the Tower of Atiminaki, and it's 297 feet high. But remember, the Tower of Babel took place 339 years after the flood, and the people there had resumed their disobedient and sinful behavior. And remember, the ark landed on Mount Ararat in Turkey, and the people moved from there to the Mesopotamia. And in chapter 12, verse 4 tells us that it was the people's desire to build a city and a tower. And their goal was to make a name for themselves. And their motives was it was a project of pride. And pride can lead to the sin of arrogance. And the people began to feel self-sufficient and that they had no need for the one and only true and living God. And arrogance breeds the belief that we can solve our own problems and that we don't need God to solve our problems. And so their goal was to create a utopian society, a perfect society without the true and the living God. And they would create a God of their own that they felt comfortable with. And so the Tower of Babel was the first attempt to build a tower to God. But God destroyed that tower and the people scattered. But that set a precedent. And later, many towers were built. Those towers were called ziggurats. Not cigarettes, but zigs with a Z, ziggurats. And King Ur-Nammu and his regime built the massive tower to worship the false moon god called Nana. And that's in the Samaritan language, it's called Nana, but in other language, it's called the word Sin. S-I-N, the moon god Sin. And later, the false god called Sin was worshipped at Haran, where Terah moved his family from Ur. And according to rabbi traditions, research of Abraham's father Terah said that he was an idol maker to the moon god called Sin. And Abraham, he rebelled against this. Abraham rebelled against those people worshiping the false god, Sin. And so Abraham, with God's calling, left Ur and moved to Haran, his brother's city. And King Ur III's dynasty came to an end when the Elamites sacked and looted Ur in 2004 BC. And if you'll notice on your sheet there, Elam was the first son on the left there. If you're looking at that of the descendants of Shem, he's the first son on the left, Elam. But the Elamites were descendants from Noah's son Shem, and they defeated Ur III, and later Abraham was a descendant from Noah's son Shem. He was 10 generations from Shem. And Abraham's brother was named Haran, and it's thought that the city of Haran was named after Abraham's brother. And also a large tower was constructed in Haran, and the city of Haran, and was the chief home of the false god, the moon god, called Sin. And so the tower was a place where people would go to worship this moon god called Sin. Now, I said all of that to say this. It was not because Rebekah's family worshiped God that Isaac sent Jacob to Haran, because they didn't worship God. Laban was a pagan, meaning he was an idolater and worshipped many false gods. And Laban possessed household idols which were called teraphims, which were small household items that worshiped the image of their false gods. And so Jacob was sent back to the land of Ur by Isaac to find a wife, not because they were worshipers of God, but because to keep the covenant bloodline clean, and because the people there worshiped, it wasn't because they worshiped God, it was to keep the bloodline clean. The word, they worshiped many false gods there, but the bloodline of Abraham's family was important. And it was to go to the firstborn, but as we'll see, it didn't go to the firstborn because of Esau. But remember, later on in history, kings became kings because of the family's bloodline. Both Mary and Joseph traced their lineage back to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob's son Judah. And so we know that Laban and Bethuel acknowledged God because of what is said in Genesis 24:50, when they recognized God's hand in the marriage of Isaac and Jacob. But let me say that to recognize God is completely different than to worship God. Many people today know God, and they know of God, but they're not worshipers of God. Now, as a review in today's lesson, Isaac and Rebekah had twins, Esau and Jacob. And Esau came out of the womb first, and Esau was entitled to the birthright of the firstborn son. And the birthright was an arrangement whereby the oldest son would receive twice as much as the father's estate as the younger son, and he would also be head of the household. And this was because of the Bakora law. But later Esau despised his birthright and opted instead to sell it for a bowl of lentil stew prepared by Jacob in Genesis 25. And this shows us a couple of things. First thing it shows us is Esau's, at this particular point in his life, his lack of willingness to take on the responsibility of a firstborn son. But also, I want you to understand that after 50 years passes before Isaac summons Esau to hunt and prepare him some wild game. And he told him, if he did that, then Isaac planned to bless Esau with the firstborn blessing. But Isaac's wife, Rebekah, the Bible tells us that she favored Jacob over Esau. And through deceit, she aided Jacob in obtaining the blessing, the firstborn blessing from Isaac before Esau returned from his hunting trip, meaning that Jacob received everything that Esau was supposed to get. And that's where we pick up in today's lesson. But this also meant that Jacob is the one that would be sent back to Ur to find a wife to keep the bloodline of the covenant pure. And so we pick up in chapter 28, verse 1. And Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said unto him, Thou shalt not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. Now, in this verse, this is the second time that Isaac blessed Jacob. The first time was when he gave him the firstborn rights. But here, Esau, in this 50-year period, Jacob now was 76 years old. And most of the people, when you read the Bible, don't realize that. But Jacob and Esau now are 76 years old. And Esau had married two Hittite women. And they had become a center of disruption in Isaac and Rebekah's life because they were constantly quarreling and bickering, the Bible tells us. And so in verse 2, Arise and go to Pandu-Yeram to the house of Bethuel, thy mother's father, and take thee a wife from thence of the daughters of Laban, thy mother's brother. And so Rebekah's mother was from Pandu-Yeram, and this was a region between Habor and the Euphrates River. in the northwest area of the Mesopotamia. And this land would become Jacob's home for the next 20 years. And verse 2 begins with arise and go, which this is an urgent request. It could be that Isaac had caught word of Esau's desire to kill Jacob, and therefore he had to make an urgent request for him to go, because he had gotten the firstborn rights. But also God commanded in verse 2 to marry one of Laban's daughters, and this was to keep the covenant bloodline pure. And the house of Bethel refers to the home of Rebekah's father, who was the son of Abraham's brother Nahor. And Bethel was Abraham's nephew, who was Isaac's cousin. And Bethel was Rebekah's father, which means that he is Isaac's father-in-law. You got all of that. But Isaac wanted Jacob to marry within the family, and Isaac commanded Jacob to marry one of Laban's daughters, and Laban was Jacob's uncle. And this is the same Laban that we talked about last week, or maybe it was a week before, when the servant Eleazar went there to find Isaac a wife. And then we pick up in verse 10, and Jacob went out from Beersheba and went towards Haran. And so now to Jacob, this trip was never meant to be a 20-year journey. Genesis chapter 27, Rebekah encouraged Jacob to stay there a few days, and this would allow Esau time to cool down and get over his anger and willingness to kill Jacob for stealing his birthright. And now the trip to Pander Yeram was about a 450 to 500 mile trip from where Jacob was. And of course this would just take several weeks just to get there. And Jacob was to go to a city in Haran, in the region of Pander Yeram, that's north of Ur. And this would be a hard journey, but it would give Jacob time to think. And also this land was going to be a place where it was a place of turmoil, it was a place of treachery, it was a place of strife, it was a place of not worshiping God, worshiping pagan gods, but it was also a land of blessings. And so what I'm saying is it would give Jacob a little bit of growing up. It would give him the full range of emotions that we all feel in this world. We have some ups and we have some downs and we have some periods where our life is even boring. But it's all part of life. It's all part of growing up. And Jacob, even though he was 76 years old at this particular time, he was not mature in God's eyes at all, as we've seen by his devious behavior just to be where he's at today. But then in verses 11 and 12, and he lighted upon a certain place and tarried there all night because the sun was set, and he took the stones of that place and put them for his pillow and lay down in that place to sleep. And so in verses 11 and 12, after several days' journey, Jacob stopped at a place called Luz, which he's going to change the name of, but right now it's called Luz. And he was completely exhausted after just 70 miles. And he was so exhausted that he used stones for a pillow. So if you can imagine, if you're so tired that you got to lay on a stone, that's pretty tired, yeah. But while sleeping, Jacob began to dream, and he saw a stairway that connected the earth with the heaven. And he saw God's angels moving up and down this stairway. And in verse 13, God stood at the top of the stairway and identified himself as the God of Abraham, which was his grandfather, and the God of Isaac, which was his father. And God had made a covenant with Abraham and with Isaac, and now he was going to extend that same covenant to Jacob to give him the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, and that Jacob would spend a large portion of his life away from, as he's going to spend the next 20 years in the land of Ur, and of course later on in his life he spends 17 years in the land of Egypt. But God is going to give him this land. And then in verse 14, and thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and thou shalt spread across to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And so I want you to understand that Jacob is 76 and he has no children now. He has no children at 76 But one of the aspects of the covenant would be that the large growth in Jacob's family. And so God promised Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars. And another aspect of the covenant was that it would require great faith, because remember at Abraham's time, Sarah, Abraham's wife, and Rebekah, Isaac's wife, had not had any children for a long period of time in their life. And so it would require faith. But now Jacob is now 76 with no children. And the third aspect of the covenant was that all people of the earth would be blessed. And of course, this would be through our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, as he is a descendant of Abraham. And in verse 15, God says, pay special attention, because I'm going to be with you to watch over you wherever you go, so that this covenant is going to be fulfilled. No matter what uncertainties you face, I'm going to be with you. And so that reminds us today that God's hand is always on the scene. God's hand is always guiding history to what his will. He gives man free will, but he can take man's free will decisions and free will mistakes and weave it around to make it come out right in the end. That being said, the consequences of those sins, of those bad mistakes, still continue to play out. He can make the end result come out right, but there's a lot of suffering in between. If somebody comes and shoots one of your children, you've done nothing to deserve anything, but that person that takes the life of one of your kids has caused heartache and suffering to come to you. But God can still forgive that sinner. He still can forgive that person that shot your child. So God can make the end result come out right, but there's a lot of suffering that goes on in between. And in verse 16, and Jacob awakened out of his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I knew it not. And so Jacob discovered that the Lord was there in that same place that he was. Keep in mind, Jacob was an older man now, but he is meeting God. And Jacob had been so preoccupied with what happened in his own life that he had become insensitive to God's presence. And how often do we get bogged down today with everyday problems that there's so many problems that we become insensitive to God and insensitive to what God can do for us. But many times God has helped us in our life. We didn't even know it because we were just so insensitive to God. We just took it for granted. It turned out that way. But God has been with us. His will's going to come about. And sometimes people get so insensitive that they don't even realize it. But in verse 17, and he was afraid and said, how dreadful is this place? This is none other but the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. And so this tells us that the place where Jacob was at, he tells us one thing, it scared Jacob. As you can imagine, if you've seen God at the top of a staircase, it would scare you too. But seeing God at the head of that staircase led Jacob to say, this is the house of God and the gate of heaven. And so in Jacob's day, of course, cities, they all had walls around them for protection, so because people tried to take over the city and would raid it. And also the city also had a gate that you could go in and out of. So what Jacob is saying is, this is the gate to the city of heaven. That's what he thought. And in verse 18, in response to his vision and dream, Jacob sets up a sacred marker or an area of worship, an altar, and this was the first of two that he would erect in this particular area, the area of Lutz, and later on he'll change the name. But Jacob poured oil on top of the stone to indicate the special religious significance of his vow that he is about to give. And in verses 19 and 20, Jacob names the place Bethel, which means house of God. Now don't confuse this with Rebekah's father's name was Bethuel with a U. This is not Rebekah's father's name, Bethuel. The place is Bethel, which means house of God. It was previously known as Lutz. But Jacob left there and he decided to make a vow to God. In verses 14 and 15, God had promised Jacob land. He had promised him descendants. He had promised him his protection. He had promised him his presence. And all that was unconditional. God was making this proposition to Jacob unconditionally by his grace. But Jacob felt like he had to make a vow anyway before he left. And so Jacob makes a vow anyway. And really what God wanted from Jacob was faith and sincerity, but Jacob felt like he had to make a vow. And then in verse 21, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God. And so here we begin to see Jacob's immaturity in God. He's sincere and he wants to make reference to God, but he's so immature in the ways of God that he wants to make a bargain with God. Nobody can bargain with God. But yet here we see the first thing in this verse is he's trying to make a bargain with God. But God could see that Jacob's heart was sincere and he just was immature. But Jacob was on a long, hard journey with many dangers, and God knew that, and God knew that Jacob's heart was sincere. But Jacob here repeats God's promises in previous verses, but also Jacob adds to God's promises. He adds in verse 20 food and clothing. So he's saying, if you also, you give me food and clothing, then I'll worship you, But in addition to all the promises, he adds to what God said. But it was just immaturity. And what God truly wanted from Jacob was faith, and God's grace would take care of the rest. But as I said, Jacob was 76, but just because you're 76 doesn't mean you're mature in God. There's a lot of 76 years old that don't know God today. Right. So just age in itself doesn't make you mature in anything. As a matter of fact, the older I get, the more I realize I don't know stuff that I thought when I was 18 that I knew. At 18, you think you know pretty much a lot of stuff, and you go around spouting out the ways it's going to be, and that's just immaturity. Then in verse 16 of chapter 29, and Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And so Jacob made this successful trip, and Jacob went to his uncle Laban's house for 2 reasons. First, Jacob had deceived his father Isaac, and he had stolen his brother's birthright, and therefore he was leaving because Rebekah suggested to Isaac that he send Jacob there to escape Esau's wrath. But secondly, Jacob was there to find a wife from Rebekah's family, and Laban was Jacob's uncle, and he had 2 daughters, Leah and Rachel. And Jacob met Rachel first and at the well, and as a matter of fact, she was bringing her father's flock to be watered. And verse 11 told us that during this encounter that Jacob kissed Rachel, which was very unusual for that day. And then he wept loudly because he thought that his journey was over. He thought he had found what he was looking for right then and there, and his journey was going to be over. And verse 16 tells us that Leah was the older of the 2. And then in verse 17, Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. And so verse 17 lets us know that Leah was less than attractive, and Rachel was shapely and beautiful. And so in verse 15, Laban asked Jacob what his wages would be, and Jacob named his wages. And in verse 18, Jacob declared he would work for 7 years in order to have Rachel's hand in marriage because he loved her. And then in verse 21, Jacob said unto Laban, Give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go in unto her. And so for 7 years, Jacob had served his uncle Laban because he was motivated by his love for Rachel. And when the 7 years ended, Jacob went to Laban to request his bride, and he was very eager to get married to Rachel. Laban made all the necessary arrangements, which consisted of a full week of celebration in that day. And verse 22 tells us there was a great feast. And then in verse 23, the night came at the end of the week that Jacob had been celebrating, and he was real excited. And there was an element of darkness involved. And I mean, if you, in Paulding County, you got plenty of lights now, you can see. But when we first moved out here, there was no lights down our street. And when it was dark, it was dark. And that's the way it was here. There was just complete darkness, and the woman had on a veil, and so Jacob married and slept with the wrong woman. And then in verse 26, Laban had substituted Leah because she was the oldest daughter. She was older than Rachel, and now Jacob had consummated the marriage with Leah. And in the morning when Jacob woke up, he recognized his new wife was not Rachel. And when he confronted Laban, Laban said, well, it was the custom whereby the firstborn daughter be married before the younger daughter. But of course, Laban knew all along that, that he should have told Jacob this ahead of time. But basically, he deceived Jacob just much like Jacob had deceived Isaac and Esau. And Jacob got his payback here. He got to feel what it feels like to be deceived. And so he learned a valuable lesson, but also he learned the lesson that all of the heartache and suffering that lying and deceit causes. And then in verse 27, fulfill her week, and we will give thee this also for the service which thou shalt serve with me yet another 7 years. And so Laban proposed another solution to the problem. He proposed that Jacob work another 7 years for Rachel's hand. But this time, Rachel could be Jacob's wife at the beginning of the 7-year period. And Jacob would receive Rachel at the end of the week of Leah's celebration. And so in verses 28 and 30 tell us that Jacob now accepted Laban's terms, and Jacob now had 2 wives. And just that in itself doesn't sound good. That in itself sounds like there's going to be a lot of problems involved. And that's what happened. Jacob, of course, was surrounded by deceit, but God would faithfully keep his promise to Jacob. But chapter 30 details the intense rivalry between Jacob's 2 wives as they tried to bear Jacob's sons. Leah bore Jacob's sons Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and daughter Dinah. And Rachel bore Joseph, and later, not right now, but later, she will bore Benjamin. Leah gives her servant Zilpath to Jacob, and she bears Jacob Gad and Ashner. And then Rachel gives her maid Bilhah to Jacob, and she bears him sons Dan and Naphtali. And so there was a lot of jealousy, a lot of envy, a lot of frustration, a lot of things going on in Jacob's life right now. And I think we'll end it right there at the end of chapter 30. Next week we'll pick up with Jacob's negotiation with Laban, as Jacob now, after the birth of Joseph, wants to leave that land. But as we'll see next week, that Jacob still has a lot of problems with Laban, and he also has a lot of problems with Esau, and all this stuff he's going to have to work out. But I think we've pretty much run out of time this week.